Hey guys, so I decided to start a brand new series, and this one's about the Punic Sicilian Wars, or as the video is called, the Forgotten Punic Wars, Greece versus Carthage, 1481 through 306 BC, full documentary, and this is by a YouTuber named Invicta, who I've seen videos about, some of his videos, but on my own time. I've never done a reaction to this guy on this channel, and I think it's time we finally fix that, because I actually have seen some of his videos and I really like them. I especially like his Units of History series. I don't know, I just really enjoyed them. So overall, expect some more Invicta a little bit in the future. So, this is gonna be about a war between Greece and Carthage. You know, I've kind of been mean towards Carthage on this channel, to be honest, and I have some pretty petty reasons as to why I've said things even like Carthage is like my least favorite civilization. Mainly because like they lose all the time. Every time they appeared on this channel, they're just always losing. Like no one more than Carthage has managed to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory in this channel's history. And I kind of like lose a bit of respect when I keep seeing losers, you know, like especially like in the military-esque, because we watch a lot of military videos and war videos on this channel. So the more losses we see, the more I kind of tend to lose respect a little. But you know, I've also seen other like nations lose a lot, like Austria, yet not dislike them. I think another big factor of why I soured on Carthage a lot, aside from them usually losing, is just the way they did my boy Hannibal. As you know, Hannibal Barca is my favorite military commander of all time, and the way the Carthaginians did him dirty in the Second Punic War just made me lose respect. I like ended up like disliking Carthage. So you know, those have been my petty reasons as to why I've kind of been like, ugh, Carthage in the past. But you know, I want to go into this more open-minded, and I really want to like see how Carthage does, because this is really interesting. If I remember correctly, by the time of the Pyrrhic Wars, during the time of Pyrrhus of Epirus, Carthage actually had a foothold in Sicily. I think they had most of the island, in fact. So, by and I think the Pyrrhic Wars come after this. So that would tell me that Carthage definitely did have success. It must have, right? At least by you see my logic right there, right? My deductive reasoning. If Carthage had that much influence on Sicily, and this is the the Punic Sicilian Wars, that would tell me that Carthage succeeded. Which will be nice to finally see Carthage actually winning. It's really rare to see that outside of like Hannibal Barca. But I hope so. Like you know, hopefully this will turn my opinion around and I'll see a different side of Carthage I have yet to see. Fingers crossed. And yeah, I don't really have much else to say other than we should probably get into the video, huh? So without any further ado, let's learn about the Forgotten Punic Wars, Greece versus Carthage, Part Uno.
Carthage was an economic powerhouse whose wealth propelled it from the status of humble colony to mighty empire.
I have to say, like, I also do know that Carthage was a naval empire, or like a trade empire, rather, is the better way to put it. Their strength was in their trade, you know. Yeah, I am fully aware of that by this point, so, you know, yeah.
But success was not achieved by the hands of explorers and traders alone. There was a blood tax to pay. This burden was shouldered by the Punic military, which deployed fleets and armies across the Mediterranean. Countless wars would be fought to establish, expand, and maintain the vast influence network which lay at the foundation of the Carthaginian Empire. But perhaps the greatest challenge would come in the struggle for Sicily. It would be here, in this proving ground, that vast sums of blood and treasure would be spilled over the centuries. Today, we'll be diving into the history of these Punic Sicilian Wars. I love learning about these units and battles of history.
Same,
But I
dude.
have to admit, they always leave me with an itch for taking up the command chair myself. But you can do so today.
Imagine being able
Dang.
to build.
Before we start, we must ask ourselves, why Sicily? What made it so special? Well, as with many historical questions, much can be learned by turning to geography. Here we find that the island of Sicily is located in the central Mediterranean, at the focal point of many important trade routes which crisscross the known world. The master of Sicily thus held the keys to controlling this vast market. Important strategic locations included the numerous natural harbors dotting the coast, the Straits of Messina, and the smaller neighboring archipelagos such as the Aegeates and the Aeolian Islands. As for Sicily itself, there is much to talk about. The land is dominated by mountains which cover roughly 25% of the terrain, with another 60% taking the form of hill country, which eventually descends into the remaining 15% of lowlands. But despite these somewhat inhospitable sounding figures, Sicily actually proved to be quite an ideal home. Its slopes were filled with many life-bringing rivers and natural springs, while its mild climate and fertile, volcanic-fed soils made it an ideal place to grow crops. In fact, Sicily's agricultural abundance would later be demonstrated when it became an important breadbasket for the Roman Republic. In addition to what the land provided, the surrounding seas also held abundant maritime resources. The primary beneficiaries of these geographic features were the early inhabitants of the island. In this regard, there were three major groups: the Illimi, the Sicani, and the Siculi.
I have to say off the bat, that's a great way to put it. Like, I never given much thought into the geography of Sicily, at least in its place in the Mediterranean Sea. But yeah, it being almost like in the center, and thus kind of having to be like a sort of hub in terms of where you could propel yourself to different directions and whatnot. Like, especially for a maritime power like Carthage, having that almost seems incredibly invaluable, which would make sense as to why Carthage would want it. And it just seems like, not only in terms of geography very rich, but like in terms of like economical potential, to them who holds it. And even the land itself seems rich in resources. So yeah, that kind of explains why it became such a very rich and sought after thing.
These tribes inhabited many settlements which sprung up across the landscape and eventually developed into a series of complex urban villages and towns over the course of the Bronze Age. Some banded together into loose federations, but by and large they remained fairly independent. However, they would not be alone for long, as others looked on to their homes with envious eyes. The enticing nature of Sicily brought new guests from across the Mediterranean. One of the earliest groups to arrive were the Phoenicians, who began to set up trade posts and establish colonies as early as the 11th century BC. These were mostly located on the western side of the island, nearest Africa, and included the early settlements of Lilybaeum, Motia, Panormus, and Salentum. At around the same time, the Greeks also began planting their own colonies on the eastern end of the island. These included the settlements of Naxos, Akragas, Gela, Ketini, Messana, and Himera.
Yeah, I do know at least of the Greeks. Obviously, I think with the Greeks that they really did colonize a lot of like the Mediterranean area in terms of just their voyages and where they landed. And influence and spread the famous Greek culture. Definitely, I think the Greeks might be one of, if not one of the most, at least here in, I guess, more westward, influential cultures and civilizations to just ever exist. In fact, you could say like a lot of Greek ideas are really fundamental, especially here in the West, you know what I mean? So yeah, and it kind of does make sense. Now I'm thinking about it. This rivalry is kind of like interesting in a sense that obviously we know Carthage being a naval economic empire, and the Greeks, who also, were islands and had their own seafaring ways, kind of like the perfect two to go against each other. I know we mainly just focus on like Carthage versus Rome and all that, but like almost seems like these two would be a much more fitting, like, you know what I mean, like fitting rivalry or pair to go against each other, at least by thinking of that.
but chief amongst them would be the colony of Syracuse, founded by the Corinthians.
Yeah, Syracuse. Syracuse has appeared so much on this channel between the time of the Roman Empire and Punic Wars and, the Peloponnesian Wars. Syracuse has kind of been... And also the rise of the Roman Empire. Syracuse has appeared a lot on this channel now that I think about it.
734 BC, it would rise to become one of the largest Greek cities of its time, with huge influence over the affairs of not just Sicily, but also the wider Hellenistic world. The introduction of these Phoenician and Greek colonies transformed the island. In many cases, their presence displaced the locals who were forced up into the central hinterlands. Other times, though, communities would live alongside each other and begin to assimilate. Over the centuries, this cross-pollination of ideas led to a fascinating meld of cultures across the region, with unique new hybridized customs, religion, and architecture. In addition, the population itself was increasingly intertwined as many new marriages bridged the divide between the various Sicilian, Greek, and Phoenician groups. The end result was a complicated web of relationships which created an incredibly fluid and dynamic political situation. Even at the best of times, the status quo was inherently unstable. This all was made worse.
I have to say, it is interesting to hear about this web of different cultures, it kind of is sort of becoming a melting pot, with everyone wanting, obviously, influence on Sicily for the previously mentioned benefits and potential of having it, and then, with them kind of, going there and spreading their influence, the Greeks and the Phoenicians, obviously creating, a hybrid of culture and people, through intermingling and whatnot. And then that would kind of bring up the point, which group has the most influence, right? The Greeks or, the Phoenicians? It would kind of create that, because, obviously I think one group wants the most power or influence, or basically control. Though it would kind of muddle, with there's a lot of different, things going on here with the crossing of cultures and blood, so it's it kind of does create a kind of a complex, who really is in control here,
By expansionist forces, which constantly feuded for control of Sicily, from both within and without. Warfare therefore became endemic, as small conflicts often snowballed into massive wars, with chains of alliances forming up on either side of any given issue. It's in the context of this turbulent backdrop that Carthage would first become involved in Sicilian affairs. One could argue that Carthage played a role in Sicily from its very founding. After all, as a colony itself, at the hub of important trade routes, its merchants surely set foot on the island many times in the pursuit of their deals. But for the most part, Carthaginian involvement remained at this relatively low level, and its projection of soft power was no more pronounced than many of the other Phoenician colonies. Things would, however, begin to change by the 6th century BC, with the decline of Tyre's influence in the west and the ascent of Carthage to take its place. The new rising Punic power was keen to flex its muscles by exerting more influence over the strategic island of Sicily, both economically and politically. This began in the west, where Carthage would offer settlements protection in exchange for tribute, manpower, and access to trade. Over time, cultural osmosis meant that many of these entered into such treaties eventually adopted Carthaginian customs and dialects. Within a few decades, Carthage thus waded deeper into the quicksand of Sicilian affairs. Sometime in the middle of the 6th century BC, this appears to have led the nobility of Carthage to finally turn its soft power into hard power. Justin, a Roman historian, tells us that the semi-mythical king Malchus took the lead by raising a large Carthaginian army and invading the island. Though few records exist, it appears that his campaign involved capturing booty and slaves, and sacking a number of areas in the western regions. Certainly this won Malchus enough profit and renown for him to return home in celebration. However, his impact on the island amounted to little more than a propaganda victory, as we have no evidence of direct rule being established over Sicily in this period. Nonetheless, the precedent set by this first campaign paved the way for future conflict. After all, Carthage had proven to all observers that it was a force to be reckoned with, one both willing and able to throw its weight around. We see this next come into play in 510 BC, when the Spartan prince Darius sought to establish a new colony in Sicily. The local Almeans of Segesta mounted an opposition to the new arrivals and appear to have turned to the Carthaginians for help. While we don't know exactly what happened, the newfound allies ultimately proved victorious in these efforts. Thus we see that parties on both sides of the narrow divide between Sicily and North Africa could take advantage of increased Punic involvement. It's hard to imagine, however, if either side could have foreseen what was to come. The catalyst for the next wave of violence took place at the start of the 5th century BC. It's at this point that the political winds had once again shifted in Sicily, as an increasing number of Greek colonies fell under the sway of tyrants. In the south, 2 Dorian Greek rulers consolidated power, with Gelon laying claim to the lands around Syracuse, while his ally, Theron, seized the central lands around Acragas. Together, they were poised to dominate the other Greek, Sicilian, and Phoenician leaders. Meanwhile, the Ionian Greek resistance consolidated in the north behind the leadership of Tirilius of Himera and Anaxilus of Rhegion. But how long could they hold out against the tyrants? For Carthage...
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I think one key aspect about, like, especially when we've covered Syracuse in the past, has always been that their leader is called a tyrant. You know? I could be wrong, but I'm wondering if the word tyrant had a sort of different meaning. Kind of like the term dictator, like the way we use dictator nowadays, it's synonymous with, like, you know, kind of like evil in a sense, kind of like ruling through, like, you know, fear. And you know, when you think of dictator nowadays, it doesn't bring the most positive connotations associated with it. But back then, like when the Romans used it, like it was different. And you know, the idea of a dictator, someone who had more ultimate power, obviously was limited to, I think, to a time period, but like still, you know, it was different. I don't think there was as much negative in the same way that we associate with the word nowadays. So I'm almost wondering if tyrant is the same, because obviously when we think of tyrant, we just think evil, tyrannical, or the word, you know, evil, etc. So like I'm wondering, because I always did know, and when Syracuse has come up, it's always their leaders called a tyrant. It seemed to have, at least from the videos we've seen, been a phrase that stuck around with the kings or rulers, you know.
This was not a question they could wait to have answered. According to the historian Diodorus, they therefore began to draft plans for military intervention. In these matters, it is likely that the rising Magnid clan and their leader Hamilcar I played a large part in directing Punic foreign policy. When Theron took over the city of Himera in 483 BC, the ousted leader Tirilius called on the Carthaginians for aid. This was the casus belli they had long awaited. A huge army was now raised, consisting of Carthaginians, Libyans, Sardinians, Gauls, and Iberians. This great host set sail from the west with a fleet of several hundred ships. At the exact same time,
I've also heard that Carthaginian, due to their wealth, often used a lot of sellswords or mercenaries rather than you know, levying their own people. So that would explain why some of their forces were more diverse, like kind of like what he just mentioned. I'm not sure that's always been the case, but like later on, they definitely used a lot of mercenaries, you know, and like bought a lot of hired help. There are even times where, like, you know, the Carthaginians hired Greek generals, like the famous Spartan one who helped them during the first Punic Wars. So yeah, they seem to utilize their wealth to kind of buy military, you know, help and manpower and talent at times.
King Xerxes of Persia launched his own assault on mainland Greece. The Hellenistic world risked being devoured from both ends. However, disunity amongst the Greeks meant that neither the Sicilians nor the mainlanders sent each other aid and defense, and many cities actually sided with the foreigners in their respective theaters. Things were not looking good. Luckily, the Greeks were favored by Poseidon, and the incoming Punic fleet was battered by storms during the crossing to Panormus, which cost them many horses.
Again, the Greeks lasted for such a while, especially against like great empires like the Persians, for example. Considering that they were divided for like most of its history, like Greeks often even siding with the invading foreign powers. Like, you know, there's always the idea of divide and conquer, and eventually it fell when the Romans came, like, you know. the Greek division did not help them, but the fact that they lasted so long being a divided people, is kind of amazing in its own right, you know what I mean?
It also meant that Hamilcar had to pause temporarily to regroup and repair his forces, which gave the Greeks precious time to mount an opposition. This allowed the tyrant Theron to fortify Himera, while his ally Gelon rushed to meet him with a veteran army of some 50,000 foot and 5,000 horse. After 3 days, Hamilcar proceeded to the hilltop city of Himera, establishing a camp with his ships by the sea and another on one of the ridges to the west of the city. Hamilcar soon managed to defeat Theron's forces in a pitched battle, forcing them back into the city and allowing his own troops to now pillage the area with apparent impunity. However, their early victories would be reversed with the arrival of Gelon from the east. The reduced numbers of Punic cavalry proved unable to hold off the enemy, and Greek horsemen overran the dispersed marauders with heavy losses. Hamilcar withdrew into his camp and sent letters now calling for cavalry reinforcements from his own Ionian Greek allies. Unfortunately, these messages were intercepted by Gelon. Rather than deny aid entirely, the clever commander disguised his own forces as reinforcements and sent them over to the enemy camp at daybreak.
Oh my god, okay, that's so underhanded, but kind of genius. Okay, that's interesting. So it seems like the lack of cavalry is what's doing the Carthaginians in. That's interesting, because they started off strong, at least in the sense of defeating these Greeks, but, you know, the arrival of Gelon seems to have reversed that fortune. But this is just cunning. Cunning, underhanded for sure, like, you know, but, that's kind of hilarious.
If they were there to help. The Carthaginians fell for the ruse and admitted the cavalry into their ranks.
Kind of a Trojan horse kind of, example, eh? Very Trojan horse-esque.
A few hours later, the main Greek force swept around the south side of Himera. In response, the Carthaginian army emerged to meet them, and a massive pitched battle ensued. Diodorus Siculus writes that, quote, "They sounded with the trumpets the signal for battle, and a shout arose from the two armies, one after the other, each eagerly striving to outdo their adversaries in the volume of their cheering. The slaughter was great, and the battle was swaying back and forth." The recent discovery of mass military graves near the site confirmed the viciousness of this fight, with hundreds of skeletons bearing the traces of deep wounds caused by arrows, spears, swords, and daggers. The two sides must have clashed in a fierce, bloody fight which dragged on for hours. At this critical moment, the trap within the sea camp was sprung, and the disguised Greeks unleashed chaos, slaughtering the bewildered Carthaginians. Here, Diodorus records the precision of the strike which unfolded. Quote, "They at once galloped to where the general Hamilcar was busy with the sacrifice, slew him, and then set fire to the ships. Thereupon the scouts raised the signal, and Gelon advanced with his entire army in battle order against the Carthaginian camp." The smoke and panic of the camp had a direct impact on the main battle, emboldening the Greeks and causing a rout amongst the Carthaginians.
Yeah, a complete, like, we've seen this before where camps get raided and just the morale breaks of soldiers, right? Especially when you're thinking, like, how are we gonna get out of here as the ships are burning, like, you know, stranding? That would cause a mass panic, right? It's like, also, the factor that the enemy's behind us now comes into mind. So, again, genius. Underhanded, but what a cunning move from the Greeks on that part.
The fighting now moved to the land camp, where Punic forces rallied, punching back against the disorganized Greek pursuers and threatening to reverse the entire situation. But the tide of battle once again changed when Theron's forces in Himera now sallied out to strike the flank. This final blow shattered the Carthaginians, who fled in all directions. Here is how Diodorus recounts the event. Quote, "Since Gelon had given orders to take no prisoners, there followed a great slaughter of the enemy in their flight, and in the end, no less than 150,000 of them were slain. All who escaped the battle and fled to a strong position at first warded off the attackers, but the position they had seized had no water, and thirst compelled them to surrender to the victors." Just under half of the Carthaginian army and a small number of ships managed to escape. Yet on the journey home, they were struck with another storm, which...
My goodness. The freaking Carthaginians, like, man. always disasters when it comes to military stuff. But then again, I don't wanna count them out yet, because according to these time codes, there are 7 wars apparently between the Greeks and Carthaginians. So I'm gonna venture to guess that the Carthaginians must win at least one of these wars. But this was already a bad start. I think this is an L for Carthage overall.
Reportedly sank most of the fleet. Thus, the First Sicilian War ended in spectacular defeat for the Punic power.
Oh, incredibly. That was a complete, like... That was a complete disaster, dude.
The victory was celebrated endlessly across the Greek world, whose armies had simultaneously managed to score wins against the invading armies of Xerxes at Salamis and Hamilcar at Himera. In the short term, Carthage is said to have braced for a counterattack. When this did not materialize, they sent embassies back to Sicily. Apparently, the Greek tyrants were content to solidify their holdings on the island and accepted a ceasefire without further bloodshed, in exchange for an indemnity of 2,000 silver talents. In the following decades, Carthage would lick its Sicilian wounds and turn its attention to other theaters of war such as North Africa and Sardinia. During this time, though, a new status quo developed in Sicily as the local powers adjusted to the Punic withdrawal. This largely benefited the tyrants Theron and Gelon, who now reigned uncontested. But as always in Sicily, peace was tentative, and coalitions inevitably reformed to oppose the current reigning power. For the most part, this took the form of the ongoing feud between the Ionian and Dorian Greeks, with the Sicilians caught in the middle. When the tyrants died, their heirs were unable to maintain their grip on power, and the island once again slipped into a fractured state of warfare with over a dozen competing factions. The question was once again posed: who would be the master of Sicily? Carthage, now having recovered and standing stronger than ever before, would have something to say on the matter.
I think I'll end the video right here, and tomorrow we're gonna cover the second one. So I guess I'll see you guys then, huh?